will be discussing the learning disability, Asperger syndrome. I chose Asperger syndrome because I work as a one-to-one aide with a student who has Asperger's, and I thought it'd be interesting to learn more about his disability and what he goes through. So learning disabilities. As defined by the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, a learning disability is something that adversely affects educational performance. IDEA requires that schools provide special education services to eligible students as outlined in the student's Individualized Education Program, or IEP. IDEA also requires a guarantee to free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. And what least restrictive environment means is that the child is pulled out from that class as infrequently as possible and is working in the classroom environment. Asperger's syndrome. Asperger's syndrome is an autism spectrum disorder, meaning it's a subcategory of autism. Autism is characterized by social and communication deficits, fixated interests, and repetitive behavior. Asperger's syndrome is considered by many to be the mildest form of ASD and is synonymous with the most highly functioning individuals with autism spectrum disorder. History of Asperger's syndrome. In 1944, Austrian pediatrician Hans Asperger observed 4 children who had difficulty integrating socially. Although their intelligence appeared normal, they lacked nonverbal communication skills, displayed no empathy towards peers, and were physically awkward. Dr. Asperger referred to the condition as autistic psychopathy marked by social isolation. Asperger's observations were not widely known until 1981, when Dr. Lorna Wing published a series of case studies where children showed similar symptoms, and she referred to this as Asperger's syndrome. Asperger's syndrome became a distinct disease and diagnosis in 1992 when it was included in the 10th International Classification of Diseases, and in 1994 it was added to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. However, in more recent years, scientific studies have been unable to definitively differentiate Asperger's syndrome from highly functioning autism, and therefore in the DSM-V5, Asperger's syndrome has been replaced in favor of a spectrum of autism. For simplicity, I will continue to refer to Asperger's syndrome rather than the spectrum of autism for the assignment. Learning symptoms. Asperger's syndrome often manifests itself through social interaction, which becomes the center of the diagnosis. In Asperger's syndrome, children lack the normal back and forth conversation, typical eye contact, body language, and facial expression. They use repetitive behavior with phrases or objects that have an excessive attachment to routines, objects, or interests. So my specific kid with Asperger's does not have a fixated interest. He does use a lot of repetition of sounds and noises, and that can often disrupt the class and cause students to become upset with him for making noises at what they deem inappropriate times. Compared with other autism spectrum disorders, children with Asperger's syndrome do not have significant delays or difficulties in language or cognitive development, and because of this, Asperger's syndrome can often go undiagnosed until the child or adult has serious difficulties in school, work, or personal life. Misdiagnosis of Asperger's is common, and it's often believed to be ADHD until it becomes clear that the difficulties for the individual stem from an inability to socialize. And children with Asperger's syndrome may become isolated due to their poor social skills or narrow interests, and this isolation can cause problems in the classroom. So the child's needs. Early intervention for a child with Asperger syndrome can be extremely helpful in having them overcome barriers and learn to better assimilate. Educational and social support programs for children with Asperger syndrome generally teach social and adaptive skills step by step using highly structured activities. Occupational or physical therapy can also be helpful in overcoming physical awkwardness and mastering motor skills. Speech therapy is also useful for the student to overcome disjointed, monotone speech or other speech-related problems. Asperger syndrome in the classroom. The most important thing for a teacher with a student who has Asperger syndrome is to just remember and understand that they're working with a student who is slightly different and may have some more needs than their other students. The student could be socially awkward with the student or the teacher, and examples of this could be avoiding eye contact when talking to or being spoken to, or misreading or understanding normal social cues. So one example of this could be a teacher is helping a student by correcting a problem or working together on a problem, or maybe the teacher is possibly reprimanding a student. And in these instances of having an adult or anybody speak to you, the normal social cue would be for that student to have eye contact with that teacher. And so the student with Asperger's may avoid this eye contact. And for the teacher working, they have to remember that this is something that is that normal of a child with Asperger's syndrome. And they have to try and work with them to either gain some of that eye contact or just understand that the student is listening and paying attention, but may be avoiding that eye contact, which would be socially awkward. So these difficulties for the child with Asperger's syndrome can cause them to become disruptive in class and disobey teachers, or which disrupts the class and bothers other students. Again, that could be back to the constant noise making or the repetitive phrases that could be spoken, and the social cues, not understanding when to be quiet or when it's time to listen to the teacher. Students with Asperger's syndrome may need more time on assignments, and this could be due to their difficulties with motor skills, which would take them a long time to write, or it could be based around their problems with problem solving or organizational skills. They also have difficulty understanding abstract concepts and difficulty differentiating between relevant and irrelevant information. So on a sort of textbook assignment where you're reading information and then answering questions, it may be difficult for them, one, to write that fast, or two, to pick out the important relevant information and then write it down. Additional problems in the classroom may result from low frustration tolerance, poor coping strategies, poor concentration, emotional vulnerability, restricted range of interests. And all of these, again, are symptoms of Asperger's syndrome. So the child may be doing a writing assignment and may be having difficulty distinguishing between relevant and irrelevant information, maybe writing slower because of their physical awkwardness, and then that could erupt into some frustration. And because of a low frustration tolerance or poor coping strategy, there might be a sort of tantrum in the classroom, and the child needs to be addressed and calmed down and told that as long as they're putting in the effort and that they are doing the work, that they're doing a great job. Of accommodation. So due to the difficulties concentrating and the trouble with motor skills, like other problems I just mentioned, teachers should allow students with Asperger's syndrome more time on assignments. Teachers should attempt to manage the classroom environment by providing consistency. They should attempt to avoid sudden changes, which can increase anxiety for the student with Asperger's syndrome. So what that could be is letting the student know when classes will be changed, or maybe giving them extra time, letting them change classes before, as to avoid overstimulation from busy halls. Could also be allowing a student to know when a fire drill might be happening that day, so they're not shocked by both the loud noise and overwhelmed with the organization it needs to line up and walk out of the building in an orderly fashion. Um, Teachers of students with Asperger's syndrome should always state the obvious. It can be hard for students with AS to remember information from past experiences or based on their common sense. Therefore, giving extra information and guidelines to work can help them succeed. And as with all students, be generous with praise. Tell your students what they did right. Using what they did right as a matter of correction rather than focusing on the negative helps them show when they're doing right and helps them build up their confidence. Compliment both successes and worthy attempts. And that just goes back to their frustration and coping skills. And if they're struggling through something and haven't fully succeeded, but have been putting in a strong effort, you want to let that student know that you acknowledge their effort and you appreciate the work that they're doing. Family life. So as with all learning disabilities, Asperger's syndrome puts added stress on the family, and each member can be affected differently. Parents and caregivers must place their primary focus on helping their child with Asperger's. This can put stress on the marriage, the other children, work, finances, personal relationships, or responsibilities. It can be difficult for parents with siblings to manage their time between the child with Asperger's syndrome and others. And it's important that parents have special individual time with all their children. They should understand that the child with Asperger's syndrome may need to be left out in certain circumstances, but will also get their own individual attention and time. And one example of an instance where it might be inappropriate to bring a child with Asperger's syndrome could be to one of the other children's plays or some sort of production that might require the child with Asperger's syndrome to sit quietly in an area for an extended period of time. And if that child cannot do that, it may be unfair to bring them to the play, and it may be unfair to your own child, the other children in the production, and those watching. So sometimes it may be difficult to make that decision, and that's where this added stress comes from. Future career and transitioning. For adults with Asperger's syndrome, social interaction and personal relationships may remain difficult. However, many affected adults work in mainstream jobs and make contributions to society. Similar to modifying the classroom, the workplace can be easily altered to accommodate an individual with AS. Examples may include providing specific instructions and explaining goals step by step to eliminate any need for inference. Boss should also be aware of how to deal with change. They should inform the worker of any adjustments ahead of time and incorporate small schedule modifications to prepare for larger changes that may come abruptly or later on in the work. And this will help reduce heightened anxiety for the individual with Asperger's syndrome. It's also important to allow for self-paced work and offer more time for learning new responsibilities. And then there should also be breaks for counseling and just general work breaks to allow a time to de-stress and to allow to cope with the work environment. Okay. And conclusion. Asperger's syndrome is an autism spectrum disorder associated with the most highly functioning autistic individuals. The diagnostic focuses on social interaction, and much of the students' problems stem from this. Students with Asperger's syndrome can show average or above average intelligence, and unlike autism, they do not have significant delays or difficulties in language or cognitive development. And again, in mid-2013, the DSM-V5 was released, and that eliminated Asperger's syndrome as a diagnosis and replaced it instead with the spectrum of autism. And here are my resources for the assignment. And I just want to thank everybody for going through with this today. I know I learned a lot from this Asperger's syndrome assignment, and it's helped me a lot in the classroom and in dealing with and understanding my student and what he goes through. Again, thank you and have a good day.